you. So it's delightful to have traveled across the globe 30 hours to be here in Australia with all of you. I wear many, many different hats. I guess I'm sort of a singer, sort of an author, definitely an activist, but also a researcher. And I've spent the last 8 years of my life working on the issue of RFID microchips in many of its guises, whether commercial applications for it, government applications and identity documents, and certainly devoted a number of years to looking into RFID implantable microchips, which is one of the big themes of this week's conference. I'm going to be talking today about the paper that I'm presenting with IEEE, the paper having to do with microchip implants causing cancer in laboratory mice and rats. There's been 16 years worth of data showing that those implants do cause cancer. I'm going to be talking about that. I'm also going to be talking about my advocacy work as the founder and director of CASPIAN, a consumer group that I founded back in 1999. And I'm going to be talking about why I think RFID, whether it's an implant or whether it's a chip in your shoe or whether it's in your passport or your driver's license, poses a real threat to our future and what it is that I believe we should do about it. All right, so with no further ado, let's see. There we go. So let me start. I assume most people in the room are familiar with RFID, but let me do a quick review. I know we're also taping this presentation as well for people who may not be as familiar. So an RFID tag, the best way to understand it, you break down the acronym. RF is radio frequency. These devices operate using radio waves. And ID is the identification part of it. They use radio frequency to transmit the identification of things, animals, or people. And the way they work is there is a tiny little microchip. If you take a look at that finger, that's actually about a 10-year-old RFID microchip. Nowadays, they've gotten them down to about a 20th of that size. So they're extremely small. You can get some of them that are small enough or so small you can barely see them. But by themselves, the microchips really don't have much power. They can't really do anything until you hook them up to an antenna. And so what you see next to there, that's an RFID microchip. I took that photograph at the Metro Future Store in Germany, where they are affixing RFID tags to inventory, things like Kraft Philadelphia cream cheese and Pantene shampoo. So what happens, you have the little microchip in the center, in that little, it's kind of hard to see there, but in that little yellow square, there's the tiny microchip. And the antenna is what it uses to pick up and transmit its information. They're called RFID tags or RFID transponders because they transmit and they respond. And typically, the RFID tags, at least the implants and the other tags that we're going to be talking about, typically don't have their own power source. They operate from a reader or some environmental power source. So in this case, what's happening is this handheld reader is emitting a radio signal in a particular frequency. That's getting picked up by the antenna, which on this particular RFID tag is X-shaped. They come in all sorts of different shapes. They're round or square. They can be small or big. And this particular antenna is picking up the signal from the reader. It's using that energy to power the microchip and get the microchip to release its information in a little burst. Typically, these microchips, if they're being used for inventory purposes, contain a 96-bit ID code, and that's really all they transmit. The same is also true for human implants, at least the commercially available version, the Verichip. Now, in the case of the Verichip, what you have is the tiny microchip, but it's been embedded into a medical-grade capsule of glass and has the antenna is actually wrapped around it inside of there. And typically, these things are referred to as being about the size of a grain of rice, but if you take a look, they're actually a little bit bigger than a grain of rice. You wouldn't accidentally get one of these in you. I'm constantly reassuring the public that there's no chance of these accidentally winding up in their pepper shaker and getting ingested, for example. They're pretty big. They are injected with a device called a cannula, and in order to get it into a person's body, you have to actually numb the area first. So the Verichip Corporation, now known as the Positive ID Corporation, in I think its 5th name change in the last decade, has been implanting them into the biceps area of the arm, right about here. And what they do first is they put an injection of lidocaine, or sort of a numbing agent, and then they take this very big injector device and they insert the microchip into the flesh. As you can see here, the top part of this microchip, well, originally when they started implanting these into people and animals, they found that they had a tendency to migrate because a slippery capsule of glass inside the body has really nothing to anchor onto. And so one of the early problems, and indeed one of the problems they're still having with these things, is called migration, meaning that you can put a microchip into a dog, they put it in the scruff of the neck, and you'll often find it as far back as the back legs. In racehorses, they had them migrating literally towards their internal organs. So that was an early problem with the implantable chips. And they've now resolved that by dipping it in a polypropylene substance. This waxy type coating here is actually a plastic coating. It's called BioBond. And what it does is it's got a very porous sort of surface to it. So when it goes into the body, there's an inflammation reaction that the body undergoes. And as part of that inflammation, the body encapsulates this device in a tissue, in a capsule of tissue. And that interweaves with this porous surface, and the idea is that that would lock it into place. Works some of the time, doesn't work all of the time. Now, the question has arisen, are these devices safe? And in 2004, in October 2004, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States approved the Verichip for use in human beings. And if you've heard of the FDA approval process, it can be a very lengthy, drawn-out, and bureaucratic process. When they approved the Verichip for human use, there were a lot of questions. And in fact, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Food and Drug Administration and said, what documents did you review? How did you assess the safety of this device? And that was in 2004. It's now 2010. I've been waiting 6 years, and I've yet to receive a response from my Freedom of Information Act request to the FDA. I'm not the only person, by the way, to have filed that request. Todd Lewin, who we'll be talking about in a moment with the Associated Press, filed a similar request 3.5 years ago and has also not heard a response. So there's deafening silence from the FDA in terms of their approval on this device. It was about a year and a half after the FDA approved the device that I got an email from someone by the name of Jeannie, whose bulldog Leon had a microchip implanted in him, like so many animals do around the globe now. And Leon developed a cancerous tumor around his microchip. So Jeannie went to her, said to her veterinarian, I think that there's obviously something to do with this microchip, that the tumor has surrounded it and is attached to it. So she was able to get the pathology report and able to actually get the tissue samples of this tumor and sent it off after about 2 years of trying to find anyone who would listen to her, sent them off to some researchers in Italy who had actually reported on another cancer that had formed around a microchip in another dog a while before that. And so they were able to look at this and did determine that this was indeed cancer. It had indeed formed around the microchip, and they believe there was an association. So Jeannie, being an extraordinary researcher in her own right and a very tenacious person, she proceeded to read everything she could find on these implants, and she discovered some little-known documentation or some little-known journal articles, not online, not in PubMed. These were articles that I had to go down into the stacks of Harvard to dig up in pathology and oncology journals, veterinary pathology reports. And anyway, that launched me on about a year and a half sort of epic adventure as things would turn out, to uncover this information, to discover that yes, indeed, these devices were causing cancer in laboratory animals. It was being reported in the scientific literature. The Verichip Corporation, the Home Again Corporation, all the companies that make implantable microchips for animals were remaining mum on this. They were silent about it. I then found out that they were receiving numerous reports from pet owners that their pets had been developing cancer in these microchips as well. So Jeannie sort of got me launched. I spent many, many hours over in the basement of the medical library at Harvard University looking these up in literally dusty stacks and photocopying them in this era of the internet. That was quite an experience. And put all of that together into a 52-page report. I shared those findings with Todd Lewin from the Associated Press. He went on his own 6-month investigative reporting adventure, speaking to cancer experts, the authors of these various studies, talking to the Verichip Corporation that was marketing this for use in humans, talking to the FDA and everyone else he could get a hold of. So it was kind of who are the folks who uncovered Watergate? One of those kinds of adventures. It certainly had that feel to it. And his story broke in 2007. So now let me tell you what we found as a result of all of that research that we did. All right, we found that these microchips are strongly linked with cancer in laboratory animals. This is rodents, mice and rats. We found that when you put these into mice and rats, between 1 and 10% of the animals implanted with the microchips develops a fast-growing malignant tumor around or adjacent to the microchip. These tumors became so large in some cases that they led to the death of the animals within a matter of weeks. They grew very, very quickly, very invasive tumors. In many cases, they metastasized, which means that you've got a tumor in one part of the body around the microchip. It releases the cancer cells into other parts of the body, and we found these animals were developing tumors or cancers in the lymphatic system and in other parts of their bodies as well. All right, this is an example of one of the tumors that was removed from a mouse. You can see that the microchip, in most cases, was located right in the center of the tumors. So when they took the tumors out of these animals and cut them open, gleaming in the middle, just like the pit of a peach, would be the microchip inside of these rather repulsive tumors. All right, let me go through some of the studies. When I was searching for this information, I used a couple of different strategies to try to identify all of the studies that had been done about the safety of implantable microchips. So Jeannie turned me on to 3 or 4 articles. I was able to use those, and of course anyone who's done academic research knows that you can look at the work cited and then sort of follow them, and you look at the works that they cite. And when all was told, that plus going through PubMed, the online medical database of medical research, I was able to find, I believe it was 13 different studies that were reviewed in all. And in 8 studies, the researchers did find cancer. So if you take a look at some of these, they go all the way back to 1996. Keith Johnson's original study in 1996, he took a look at 2,000 mice that had been implanted over a 2-year period and found that about 1% of them developed cancer. Tillman and colleagues in 1997, looking at over 4,000 mice over their lifespan, found that just under 1% developed cancer. Palmer, 800 mice looked at over 2 years, found that 2% were developing cancer. And as you go on down the list, you see that it's between 0.8% and just over 10% of these animals developing cancer. All right. Now, when, as an academic researcher, I can say that the word cause is a word that you avoid like the plague, and I'm sure anyone in here with an academic background knows you never use the word cause, you use the word associated with, found in conjunction with. What I found really interesting about these, the write-ups and the research by these pathology and oncology researchers, who, by the way, really were not looking for microchip implant reactions. They were actually doing other studies, but they were so stunned by the number of animals getting sick that they kind of took time out from the other research they were doing to write up their findings. And they used the word cause. They used the word induced. In fact, they began referring to these tumors as microchip-induced tumors. So here the transponders were the cause of the tumors. There was an unequivocal association between the implant and the sarcoma. The tumors are clearly due to the implanted microchips. So rarely in my research have I seen such clear language that this was not just linked, but they were clearly attributing these tumors to the presence of the microchips. In all cases, the tumors developed at the site of the microchip. This is an example of another tumor. This one, I believe, was removed from a rat. And in this case, you see the cross-section of the tumor, and that little hole there is where the microchip was removed from. When they looked microscopically, and these reports go into actually quite a bit of detail and quite a bit of depth, so anyone with a background in oncology would certainly find that they had done extensive amounts of research and homework on this, examining these things histologically and in every other possible way that oncology researchers can do this. And what they found is that the inflammation process around these microchips and the process of forming that little capsule of tissue around the microchip was giving rise to the tumor. And the question was, what was that process? And I'll get to that in just a moment, what might have been giving rise to that process. But they did find that it was arising from that tissue capsule. All right, so in going over these 8 different studies, I was able to extract a couple of different hypotheses as to why these implants might be causing cancer. The first one has to do with foreign body tumorigenesis. That is the fact that any foreign body implanted into any animal has the potential to form a cancer. That is sort of a known outcome that is possible. In this case, the hypothesis is that those cellular changes that were the inflammation process and then the tissue formation process itself, something in that might go awry and lead to the cancer. The second one is post-injection sarcoma, and veterinary researchers will tell you that when you give a cat a regular vaccination, you just immunize a cat against some feline leukemia, etc., that a small percentage of cats will actually develop a cancer in response to the injection, and that's called post-injection sarcoma. So one of the questions, is this coming from the actual injection process itself? It's one possibility. The third, I think, is the more disturbing one, that the implant itself may have genotoxic properties, and I'll explain in a moment why that is a strong possibility. That something in the implant, whether it is the glass, whether it is the electromagnetic radiation that's occurring around that, or whether it's the biobond, the plastic substance, something in there appears to be genotoxic, and those are materials that actually damage the genetic material in an animal and can give rise to cancer as a result. And then fourth was the question, does the radiofrequency aspect of this, does the fact that you've got an active transponder that is picking up and responding to electromagnetic radiation in the environment, could that inside of the body be somehow implicated in the cancer? And it could be a result of all 4 of these, or perhaps none of these. We don't know. More research needs to be done to determine that. All right, so that gets us to the question of human microchip implants. The question that arises, and I'm going to go through a series of frequently asked questions about this research. You can find this, by the way, if you go to our website at antichips.com. There's an FAQ document on there with answers to over 80 different questions about implantable microchips, everything from who manufactures them, who they're implanted in, how they are removed, the social implications, the surveillance questions, security questions. It's all in there, and these are some of the questions that are more specific to this cancer research. So are the microchips that have been causing cancer in these laboratory animals the same as the Verichip that was approved by the FDA and has now been implanted into what some estimates say is about 2,000 people worldwide? And the answer is yes, they're virtually identical. Right here in this picture, you see 2 microchips, 2 implantable microchips. One of them is an animal microchip, one of them is a human microchip. And to be honest with you, I don't even remember which is which anymore. I've got it labeled back on my computer, but they look the same. The only difference is the human microchip has a 16-digit ID number encoded into its internal microchip, and the animal microchip has a 10-digit ID number encoded into the microchip. But other than that, they're identical. So could humans develop cancer from implantable microchips is the next question, because we do know that with this device approved by the FDA, and I'll get to just a moment as to whether the FDA was aware of the cancer research, this is the big question, because as you may know, this device is being marketed for use in human beings to manage medical records, heaven forbid, to control advantaged people, for use with payment applications, security applications, or employment tracking. There have been 2 different cases of employees being microchip implanted. One of them is the City Watcher Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States, where the president of that company, along with one of his employees, had a microchip implanted in his arm to access a secure records room. The other case is the Attorney General of Mexico, who, along with 18 members of his staff, was implanted with a microchip for the same reason, to access a secure records room. And we could get into all sorts of questions about why the implantable microchip is a terrible idea for security, but I will leave that to you to go to antichips.com for that information in our FAQ. So as far as implanting human beings with microchips, could they cause cancer? Well, we do know that any foreign body or any foreign material implanted into a human being has the potential to lead to cancer. Humans are less susceptible to developing cancer from foreign bodies than are mice or rats. Mice or rats are actually quite susceptible, and the 1 to 10% is probably way more than we'd be likely to see in human beings or even in dogs. The reason mice and rats are used for this kind of research is because they do have a higher likelihood of developing cancer, but the reason they're used in cancer research and in toxicology research is because they give you an indication as to what sorts of things may lead to a smaller percentage of human beings developing cancer. So I would say, and along with many of the researchers, which Todd Lewin from the Associated Press ran this past, cancer experts who work on human cancer research, they have all pretty much universally said that this would be a serious cause for alarm, that these animals were developing cancer. All right, when our study came out, and in our FAQ document, we have a whole section on lies that have been told by the RFID industry, and it's been really kind of an interesting experience watching them spin the story. One of the articles that came out in Time magazine was actually written by Scott Silverman, the CEO of the Verichip Corporation, and I would encourage you to take a look at that in our FAQ document, because it was really just an extraordinary piece of propaganda and full of inaccuracies. And I'm going to address just a couple of these here in case you may have heard some of these. I'd like to dispel these myths. The first thing that the Verichip Corporation said is that these studies were conducted in animals that were prone to developing cancer. Well, in 5 out of 6 of the studies where mice and rats developed cancer, they were using standard Sprague-Dawley and other types of standard laboratory animals. These animals are used because they're hardy and because they're actually resistant to developing spontaneous tumors. That's why they're used in toxicology studies, so that when they develop a tumor, you know that it's probably a result of what they've been exposed to. One of the animals, I'll get to that in a moment. All right, one of the animals in 1 out of the 6 studies, the animals were genetically modified. This is the P53 mouse, which is modified to lack a portion of one of its genomes. That makes it more susceptible to a very specific type of cancer, which is in response to exposure to genotoxins. Now, these mice are, again, selected specifically because they do not develop cancer spontaneously. They only develop cancer in response to exposure to a genotoxin. And these mice had the highest rate of exposure. 10.2% of these mice developed cancers around the microchip. So that gives a very, very strong, I think, cause for concern that if these particular mice, which before the age of 6 months hardly ever develop spontaneous tumors, we see 10% of them getting tumors, that would indicate that maybe that hypothesis about the genotoxic attributes of the microchip may be accurate. Now, one of the questions that's been raised about this research is that the researchers who reported on this over that 16-year period had not set out specifically to look at the safety of implantable microchips. They were actually doing other studies. They had taken these thousands of mice or thousands of rats and injected them with microchips as a way to identify them, to separate them into a control and an experimental group while they experimented with other compounds and chemicals. What was surprising to them was that even the animals that had not been exposed to those chemicals, the control animals, were developing cancer at about the same rate as the animals who had been exposed to the toxins. So the fact that control animals whose only exposure to anything was the microchip implant were developing these cancers was enough cause for concern for these researchers to take time out from the other work that they were doing and dive into this particular research. Now, my guess, this is probably happening in laboratories all over the world. If it was happening in these particular cases, these are studies out of Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R, the aspirin, big pharmaceutical company. These studies were happening at universities across Europe. These studies were happening in a lot of different places. These were the only folks who took the time to actually write them up, though. So this is they did not set out to investigate the effects of the implants, but nevertheless they were finding these cancers in the animals. One of the this one I thought was amazing. Someone said that, or I think it was Scott Silverman or someone from the Verichip Corporation saying that the fibrosarcomas that were found were benign. That would mean non-cancerous, and that's just utterly nonsense. All right, one of the other questions, haven't there been studies where chipped animals did not develop cancer? And as I said, I went through the literature. I went through PubMed, and I went through all of the articles referenced in sort of the starting set of articles that I had found. And we did find 3 articles which have been widely cited by the RFID industry as evidence that these microchip implants are safe. Back in 1990, Rao and Edmondson did a study where they took a number of mice, implanted them with microchips, and did not see really any result or any reaction in those animals. If you take a look, though, at the numbers that they were looking at, 10 mice over 3 months, 10 mice over 15 months, 74 mice over 2 years, this really doesn't compare to, let's see if I can get to it, to the studies where cancer was found, where you're looking at 1,200 animals, 1,040 animals, 177, 800, 4,200, and 2,000 animals. So going back, these other studies where they implanted the microchips into dogs, literally looking at 2 dogs for 3 days, looking at only 1 dog for 6 years. Given that this is only likely to happen in about 1% of animals, you really would need a much larger sample size in order to see any kind of an effect. We also found that typically these cancers were occurring in the second half of the animal's lifetime. So in the case of a mouse, that would be in the 2nd year of its life. So if you're only looking for a couple of months or 6 months, you're not going to find the cancers. All right, this gets us to the question of the safety of the human implant. Was the FDA aware of this research when they approved the implantable microchip? And everything I've been able to piece together, short of having my FOIA request responded to by the FDA, strongly indicates that they were not aware of this information. The FDA has confirmed that when they approved the Verichip device, that they relied solely on the Verichip Corporation to provide evidence of the device's safety. So that was very interesting. So the FDA approval panel did not do any independent research. They did not look up or go onto PubMed or do any of the things that I did. They relied solely on a sheaf of documents that was provided to them by the Verichip Corporation as evidence of this device's safety. We know that once this story broke in 2007, that both the CEO and the senior medical officer of Verichip both emphatically denied having any knowledge whatsoever of any studies linking their product to cancer. So that would certainly indicate that if they weren't aware of those studies, they did not provide them to the FDA. Then right on the heels of that, when the Verichip Corporation was pressed a little bit further on this, they said, oh, well, we knew about the studies, but we decided not to include them in our sheaf of documents provided to the FDA because they weren't relevant. The one they specifically talked about was the Blanchard study. That's the one with the P53 mice, which I believe is probably the most relevant of the studies because it shows that these things are genotoxic. And they specifically said that they did not give that information to the FDA, that they withheld that from the FDA because it wasn't relevant because they were genetically modified mice. By the way, if you actually read that Blanchard study, it makes reference to Keith Johnson's study as well, which also found cancer in the microchips, or in the microchips were causing cancer. So if they had that one, they had the other one, and that should have probably cascaded them into finding the same information that I did. But we don't believe that that information was ever given to the FDA. All right. So that's a little bit of background. Are there any questions on the implantable microchips and the cancer research before I go on to the second part? Yeah.
In the states that the federal government in the states requires animals to have RFID implants in the national program regulated by the Department of Agriculture. Have you done any investigation into findings with the farm industry, the farm lobby, with respect to what you're claiming to be clear evidence of cancer caused by these implants?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm going to be getting to here in just a moment is some of the regulatory issues that we've been looking at. I would say here in this portion of the globe where you need to be concerned is New Zealand. New Zealand requires that every dog in the country, I believe they may have gotten an exemption for farm dogs, but every other dog in the country is required by law to be implanted with a microchip. And we're starting to see a rash of microchips causing cancer in dogs now, and I'll get to that in just a moment. In the United States, it's really region by region, and in fact, I believe that there is a state in Australia that is requiring mandatory microchips. I don't think it's New South Wales. I think it's one of your other states here. Yes, do you know where it is?
Oh, no.
Okay, hang on. So in the U.S., there are certain cities, like unincorporated areas of Los Angeles County. The County Board of Supervisors has passed a law requiring all animals over 4 months of age to be implanted with a microchip. So as far as the program that you're talking about, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture's federal farm animal registration program, that actually does not require microchip implants. It requires, and by the way, it's not even being implemented because there's been a lot of backlash. That's sort of on the table being discussed right now. But that requires that all animals be uniquely numbered and that number be provided to the federal government. How a particular farm or farmer chooses to number the animals under their care is up to them, though. So a lot of them are using RFID ear tags, which are plastic tags that hang down, and the RFID component is below it. It's kind of like an earring on a cow. That's a much more likely candidate than an injectable microchip. Yes?
Are any studies being conducted to discern if there's some systematic difference between the animals that get cancer?
Well, given that I would love to see more studies on this, to answer your question. What's interesting about this is that these animals are almost genetically similar. They're almost genetically identical because of the way that they're bred for use in laboratory research. So if you have a group of 1,000 animals and 1 or 10% of them is developing cancer, presumably those animals are very genetically similar to their brethren. And so the real question comes up, what is it that's causing these cancers across the board? Would they have developed in the other animals over a longer period of time? Is there something different? We don't know that, but we do know that they're living in the same cages, they're eating the same food, they're drinking the same water, they have the same environmental exposures, they're the same age. So, what makes one of them get cancer and not another one is a question they've been asking for years about other kinds of cancer research as well. You give animals saccharin, some of them get cancer, some don't. All right, yeah?
You categorize the United States RFID as a drug. It's a medical device, right?
It's a medical device.
Okay, and the second question is the agency in charge of that the same for drugs or for medical devices?
It's the same agency. The Food and Drug Administration, the US FDA, has a division that deals with medical devices and another division that deals with drugs. Yeah.
And you don't have to make medical trials before getting it free for the public in the United States.
You do for drugs, but for medical devices, you don't. So there's
This is a medical device.
This is a medical device, yes. It's a Class 2 medical device. That's how it's been classified under the FDA regulations. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit. I've been an activist working on issues of privacy and databases and the like since 1999. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, I actually became frustrated at the supermarket frequent shopper cards that were making a record of my purchases, and that launched me on a whole career of working on privacy issues and technology. When I stumbled across the RFID industry back in 2002, I was horrified at the planes that I discovered that this industry was involved in, and I'll talk about a little bit of our advocacy work on the RFID industry and the implants. All right, one of the things that's been coming up for me recently, and in fact next month, we're about to launch a brand new initiative called chipmenot.com. If you read to the end of my 52-page microchipping article and now the 12-page version that's going to be published by IEEE, you'll find that we have a series of recommendations there. One of them is that we do need further study, as you pointed out, to try to understand why these animals are getting cancer. We have recommendations for veterinarians and pet owners as well, that if you have an animal that has been microchipped, you want to regularly pet that animal and sort of feel for any lumps, tenderness, heat, swelling, anything that might indicate something unusual. If you do find that, you need to go to your veterinarian immediately. In the cases where the microchips caused cancer and it was found by the pet's owners, not by the veterinarians. And in some cases, they even came back with normal lab results, but there was a malignancy forming around the chip. So we've got a whole series of recommendations. The one that I think is most important, and I'd like to see this established worldwide, is a registry for adverse reactions. Now, we have that for human implants. So if people implanted with the Verichip under FDA regulations were to develop problems from it, there would be a formal procedure for reporting that. But in the case of animal health, there is no such registry. So you could have an animal device that's causing huge problems in animals, and the company, even being aware of it and receiving numerous phone calls and numerous veterinary reports, would have no obligation at all to report it to anyone. So we'd actually like to see that change, that devices that are impacting animal health probably should have a requirement that there be some reporting. What we're doing in light of the fact that that doesn't exist is we're actually creating a registry on the internet for anyone to report to, and we're going to break that down into reports that have been peer-reviewed and published in academic journals versus reports that have been validated and substantiated by a veterinarian or a pathologist versus simply anecdotal reports from the public. So we'll have 3 different levels of reporting on there. We're doing this in response to a number of people who've contacted me personally saying, my dog just died with an enormous tumor. This dog that you see on the left is a bull mastiff named Seamus, and Seamus just died a couple of months ago with a 4.3-pound tumor surrounding 2 microchips that he had been implanted with. His owner did not know that the breeder had already put a chip in him. He was walking past one of these free, microchip your dog for free today booths, had a second chip put in him, and within about a year, Seamus had developed a tumor that grew and grew and finally took his life. The dog that you see on the right is Scotty. He is a terrier who just died last week, and his owner, Linda Hawkins, is beside herself. She had him microchipped, and he developed a tumor around the chip and required extensive surgery. He's been on chemotherapy for the last 6 months, and he finally passed away last week. If you look on the internet, you can simply do a search in the dog forums, and you'll see whenever this topic comes up, inevitably someone in the comments will say, what do you know, my dog had a cancer on its neck, and when they removed it, there was a chip in it. So we're seeing this over and over, and yet there's no public process for any kind of clearinghouse for this information. So we're creating that. We're actually looking to put together an advisory board of experts who would like to work with us. So if anyone in this room would like to work with us in an advisory capacity, we'd love to talk to you. But that should be launched sometime within the next 6 weeks. We've already done all of the programming for a form where people can log on and put in the information and upload information about their animals. Some of the other things we've done, as I said, I worked for about 6 months with Todd Lewin with the Associated Press to get the story out about the implanted microchips causing cancer back in 2007. That story was reported all over the world. I wish it had had more of an impact on stopping some of these mandatory dog chipping regulations that still seem to be moving full force. But what it did do was stop this. They were implanting Alzheimer's patients at a place called the Alzheimer's Community Care Center in West Palm Beach, Florida. They had 200 of these people lined up ready to be implanted. And here's the problem. The Verichip Corporation, which is now the Positive ID Corporation, they're selling a product that no one wants to buy. The company has steadily lost money. I think the last year they reported income, they earned less than $2,000 total for the entire year off of their chipping operations of humans. So nobody wants their product, and they keep kind of trying to find these captive populations that they can chip. They were able to get an Alzheimer's daycare center to agree to microchip these folks. As a human sciences researcher myself, I was horrified that there was no institutional review board, there was no ethics panel, there was no review whatsoever as to the ethics of implanting, as part of a research study is what they called it, implanting people whose mental impairment meant that they couldn't give informed consent. So not only were they crossing a serious ethical boundary in terms of using Alzheimer's patients as their guinea pigs, but there was no oversight whatsoever of this trial. And it was featured on Good Morning America, breathless reports about it. So we protested. I headed down to Florida, and a group of CASPIAN members and I got together outside of the Alzheimer's Community Care Center, and we said, you need to stop. You shouldn't be doing this. And that was right about the time that the cancer story was about to break, so I knew that was going to happen right on the heels of this event. And as a result of that, Blue Cross Blue Shield canceled its trials. They were doing voluntary medical trials with patients to see if diabetics and others would benefit from having a microchip that could be scanned in the event they were unconscious, that would link to their medical records. I was contacted by one woman who was actually part of that trial, who contacted me to say that she had had her microchip implant removed, that it was a painful process. She sent me a photograph of her arm, which was black and blue from here to here and swollen, because the process of getting these back out of your body is actually extremely invasive. They form, as you can see here, they form a capsule of tissue that that will biobond, really does bond to the body, and it's difficult to cut that back off again. So I've heard Scott Silverman of Verichip refer to this as a reverse injection procedure. Nothing could be further from the truth. And this is when they gratified me. Just before our protest in Florida, and just before the story broke, Verichip, because of its coverage on Good Morning America, because of its chipping of the Alzheimer's patients, had managed to inflate their stock up to over $11 a share. And after the cancer stories broke and all the studies were quietly canceled and people were getting their microchips removed, we saw them tank. And in fact, they were on the verge of being delisted from the stock exchange and becoming a penny stock. This seems to happen to this company periodically over and over, but it was gratifying to see it happen then. All right, and now finally, I'd just like to give you a sense of why I have devoted 8 years of my life to working on the issue of RFID, and that is because there are some really horrifying plans afoot for what the powers that be would like to do with us once we become microchipped. And whether that is microchipped with an implant, whether that is microchipped with an ID card, whether that's microchipped with a chip in your shoe, the plans are out there, and they're very disturbing. So I'd like to share those with you. If you'd like to learn more about this, you can read our book Spychips, which, even though it was published in 2006, is probably more timely today than it was then. It was a book about 5 years ahead of its time. All of the things that we reported on in that book are happening in lockstep, one after another. It is like a roadmap to the future. All right, RFID, as you may know, is now converging with payment devices. We've got a couple 100 million RFID-enabled credit cards that have already been issued around the globe. What this means is that payment stations, what the industry calls POS, or point-of-sale terminals, what we would call a cash register, are now being equipped all over the globe with the ability to, if someone were to choose to do this, to pay with simply a wave of your hand, or just pressing your hand to the reader device. The technology is the same. The RFID chip in a credit card is essentially the same device that you can put into your right hand, and I believe Emil Grafstra is going to be talking to us about having a chip in his hand. So the infrastructure is being built in order to do this. When I say it's the same technology, it operates on a slightly different frequency. There's a couple of technical things that would need to be tweaked in order to retrofit this to accommodate an implantable microchip, but it could certainly be done. RFID tags are already being used in a number of applications, in amusement parks, in theaters, in outdoor theaters, music shows, concerts, and the like. People are already using these RFID tags. Same idea, you just swipe your wrist, and that gives you access to walk into a building, or access to pay for something, or open up the turnstile, or ultimately, probably the next step would be to get on the subway. Your subway tickets all over the world now are incorporating RFID as well. So we're building the infrastructure for RFID to be your system to access things, to make payments, to get into places, to authorize yourself, and that is just one step away from the chip in you. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security, in the post-9/11 frenzy of hysteria that they're undergoing, has begun issuing RFID tag driver's licenses. Now, currently they're voluntary. We had a big fight in our country a couple of years back over something called Real ID, which was a national ID card. I know you guys, and thank you, that here in Australia you fought that back into its ugly cave as well. But all around the globe, India, Mexico, places where you normally wouldn't even think of a national infrastructure, a database of citizens, there they're all moving to a national ID program. And if you've never heard of it, there's an organization called the Porvoo Group, Porvoo, out of Finland, which wants to consolidate all national IDs to be part of a global standard, and they're working with the UN to accomplish that. So we know that this idea of global ID is coming. We know that the passport, the ICAO, I'm not remembering my acronym right, but the global organization that manages travel documents has already put RFID tags in virtually everyone's passports, including U.S. passports. And now the Department of Homeland Security is putting them into certain people's driver's licenses. If they want to pay a little bit extra, they can cross the border into Canada or Mexico with this remotely readable chip. The problem is it's readable from 30 to 60 feet away, right through your purse, your wallet, or your backpack by anybody with a reader. It's not encrypted, it's not protected, it's not shielded, it is not anything. It is a straight number that beams straight out over the air, and in fact the guy in the back room at Walmart with his little RFID inventory scanner can scan you from 60 feet away. Creepy stuff. Anybody who's taken notes, you can look up a YouTube video by a guy named Chris Paget, P-A-G-E-T. Chris Paget actually drove down the streets of San Francisco with a reader on the side of his car and picked up half a dozen of these in just 2 hours, just out of people's wallets. All right, let me talk about some of the company plans. IBM, the bad boys of this RFID space. IBM has patented something called the Person Tracking Unit. Lovely name, that's their name, not mine. They came up with this idea to use RFID tags on people's belongings or on them to track them. Plain and simple. RFID is tracking technology. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. That's why it was developed. That's how it's promoted. That's how it's used in warehouses. It is used for tracking, period. They say when a person carrying or wearing items having RFID tags enters, an RFID tag scanner scans the tag on that person to determine their exact identity and track them around. Where do they want to track people? What are we talking, like nuclear facilities? No. We're talking about everywhere. Shopping malls, airports, train stations, bus stations, elevators, trains, airplanes, restrooms, sports arenas, libraries, theaters, museums. In other words, everywhere. Everywhere. That's the plan. And if you look up IBM's Smarter Planet website, if you want to get chills down your spine, take a look at the number of things that IBM wants to control, and they want to use RFID to do it. RFID tags embedded in your belongings is what I've primarily been fighting, and I think we were pretty successful with that. We did a big boycott against Bennett back in 2003 that got them to cancel plans to put 15 million RFID tags in women's bras and underwear. So not only could you track a woman around, but you could actually, with your little click of your reader device, you could determine what color her bra was. Creepy stuff. So we fought back, we got that stopped, and now plans like this one to put RFID tags in your shoes have kind of been put on hold, thank goodness. Otherwise, I believe, had we not been doing this work since 2003, that probably every single person in this room would be carrying probably at least a dozen RFID tags. That's how gung-ho the industry was back in 2002, 2003. So where have they gone instead? Well, this plan is not going away. This plan to use doorways and readers and place these things everywhere is still moving forward, but it's moving forward with a slightly different plan. Now, instead of saying we want to track inventory and people for marketing purposes, now they're saying we want to track people for anti-terrorism purposes, for security purposes. So this idea that as you walk through a doorway, you could be identified, and by the way, take a look at the one on the right, because this really gave me the creeps when I saw it. We all know when we walk through a portal this way, but you could walk through a wide open space and they could sandwich you this way, and you'd never even know that you'd walk through a reader device. So they're working on it. This is a great example of how this stuff can be abused. Whenever I testify before a government committee and a lobbyist for the RFID industry gets up, they always say, oh, Katherine Albrecht, she's pie in the sky, none of this stuff is even possible, it's not feasible, it'll never happen. And I always point to Alton Towers, which is a British amusement park where they actually issue you an RFID wristband when you go into the park. And as you walk around the park, you go on the ride, you eat a hot dog, go to the bathroom, do whatever you do. There are stations all around the park with hidden video cameras linked up to RFID readers. And as you walk by, they detect this little chip on your wrist. They take a couple of, 15, 20 seconds of footage of you walking by, and then they store it in your file. See, that's what makes this different from a standard surveillance camera. Surveillance camera watches the 20 feet in front of it. If something happens there, then they know about it. If it doesn't, whatever. And they have to go back through hours and hours and hours of footage to see when you walk through those 20 feet. But with RFID, you can take your surveillance cameras and you can actually create a dossier of where one single individual was on all of your cameras. And so what happens at the end of the day is you go to leave Alton Towers, you go past this big desk, and there's a screen behind it, and as you approach, the system reads your chip and starts playing all these videos and little screens behind there, and you get to see you going, at the water slide, and you get to see yourself eating the ice cream, and then this very friendly woman says, for just 20 pounds British sterling, you can buy a DVD memento of your trip today and see all of these videos. So if they can do it in Alton Towers, they can do it elsewhere, and they are doing it elsewhere. Well, this one's hypothetical. Well, I don't know. I'm sure this company doesn't think it's hypothetical, but there are companies actually working on ways to implant RFID readers into forests, into every square acre of land on the globe, using the vibrations of the wind passing through trees as a power source to transmit this information. All right, so now let's talk about where it's not theoretical. China. Biggest RFID market on the globe in 2008. It wasn't Walmart. It wasn't Gillette. It wasn't all the people I've been fighting. It was the government of China, who put in an order for over 1 billion RFID tags to go into every national ID card issued to every Chinese citizen. And if you've got one of these in your pocket, which you are required by law to do if you're Chinese, then a Chinese government official, a communist police officer, could simply point his reader device at you and get back a database of information that would tell him your entire educational history, your health history, your employment history, even your reproductive history, all in his little handheld device. Now, these national ID cards were not put in place by Chinese corporations. They were put there by American companies, by Western companies. IBM, Cisco, Dell, Hewlett-Packard were all the companies that helped China put this whole system together. And where they're testing this out, their petri dish is Shenzhen, China. It's a big industrial city, high-tech, lots of high-rises, lots of modern industry there. And what they've done is they've turned the city of Shenzhen, China, into a tracking laboratory, as it were. They are linking up the same kinds of things that we saw at Alton Towers, where they've got the video cameras hooked up to the surveillance, hooked up to the RFID, because they've got a captive population of 1 billion people walking around with this technology. And you better believe IBM would love to test out its person tracking units and its smarter planet, and they've got the perfect place to do it with the help of the Chinese government. And what I love about China, if there is something you could love about this, is that China at least is open about what they're doing. When the New York Times asked the guy in charge of this program, why are you doing this? You know, in the U.S. they'd say, oh, well, we've got a real problem with terrorism, or we've got a real problem with identity theft. I don't know what they say, but they give you a song and dance. In China, they don't bother. They don't have to. In China, this guy said, oh, it's to control the population in the future. Yeah, how's that for stark? All right, so how are they going to sell this in our country? Stop the terrorists. ID the immigrants, big issue in my country. Mexican immigrants, got to ID them all. End identity theft, protect the kids. Let's track everybody. Just stick a chip in your kid in the hospital and they'll never be kidnapped. What they don't tell you, by the way, is that the National Network to End Domestic Violence, who are probably my closest allies in some of these battles, they know that the stalkers, the kidnappers, the abusers, the pedophiles, they're the first people to latch onto new technology. If you put a chip on your kid, then they're going to use that to figure out where your kid is, and when your kid's alone, and when your kid takes a shortcut through a back alley. So the last thing in the world you want to do is put an RFID tag on a child. Please, whatever you do, don't do that. All right, so the big question, and what always comes up whenever you have these conversations about civil liberties is, well, you know, who cares? I'm not doing anything wrong. Real quick, and you can read, there's a chapter, the chapter that I am most proud of in our book Spychips, chapter 16, is called The Nightmare Scenario, What If Hitler Had RFID? And that's really where I take the gloves off and get into the real philosophy of why I do what I do, and why we as a people across the globe must fight this technology. And that is because no matter how much you trust your current government, there are evil people. What people don't realize is that, well, here's Hitler. R.J. Rummel, a great book called Death by Government. He is a political science professor at the University of Hawaii. Devoted his life to studying something he calls democide, the killing of people by their own governments. And what he found after 40 years of research is that government is the most deadly force on planet Earth, second only to natural causes and disease. He found that in the 20th century alone, governments were responsible for 6 times more deaths than all of the century's wars combined. Think on that for a moment. So here we are, all stressed out because 3,000 people died because of a terrorist attack in the World Trade Center. And in response to that, and that was a tragedy, I won't deny that, but in response to that, we are creating the bars to a prison. We are creating a technology that will make it possible for hundreds of millions of people to be rounded up, tyrannized, controlled, and ultimately potentially liquidated. So I am very much in favor of liberty across the globe. I believe the main way you get liberty is you limit the power of those who would control you. And the best definition of government I ever heard is government is nothing more than people who have sought power over other people and obtained it. So bear that in mind the next time somebody says we need more control over your life in order to monitor and track you and keep you safe. Ultimately, history tells us that when people are controlled and monitored, they are not safe. And if you don't believe it, who was the most surveilled people on the globe in the 20th century? The answer was probably the Soviets under Stalin. KGB had the power, the ability to listen in on all the phone calls, open up all the mail. They had informants. I think it was at one point it was something like 1 in 10 people was in some way or another involved in informing on their neighbors. So, you have a backyard barbecue, and the guy you're sharing a beer with could be reporting on you if you say the wrong thing. If that made people safer, probably did. I'm sure under Stalin there was less random street crime, maybe less random theft or break-ins or rape or murder. But Stalin's regime was the most deadly in all of human history. He killed over 60 million of his own people. And he was able to do that because he had the power over them to know who opposed his rule. So I would, there's lots more I could say on that topic, but I would refer you to Chapter 16 of Spychips. And if you want to understand more about RFID, the microchip implants, I've got the paper that we're submitting here to IEEE summarizes all of the research that I've done. You can also go to antichips.com. We've got a whole ton of information. And if you are a radio listener, you can go to katherinealbrecht.com. We have a daily radio show. And let me take some questions. Do we have time for a couple? All right. Yeah.
Very interesting talking to you.
I'm sorry, speak up.
It was very interesting talking to you. Really liked it. I'm quite interested in the Alton Towers case with respect to tracking customers using ID.
Wait, which case?
The Alton Towers case, the theme park.
Oh, Alton Towers, right, yeah.
Sorry, so Alton Towers. And are the customers of the theme park informed in this?
They are, yeah. And in fact, I believe that after there was some initial concern over that, you're actually asked if you'd like to carry the wristband. I'm not concerned about Alton Towers because the particular patrons at that location are being tracked, because I believe they are pretty upfront about it. I use that example to say that it is possible to create this kind of a tracking system in a way that would not be quite so open or visible. Yes?
Yes, Captain, is it true that the American health bill that's just gone through very controversially has legislation in it to allow the usherings into RFID implants?
Yes and no. The question was whether the new, what we call Obamacare, the new health legislation that was just passed in the U.S., whether that has a provision for chipping people. And the answer to that is no. There's actually a rumor going around that there is a provision in the bill, and this is true, there is a provision in the bill that says that Class 2 implantable devices will have to be registered with the FDA. But if you take a look at Class 2 medical devices, it's a huge class of implantable items. So in that case, it's not targeting specifically RFID microchips, which is a teeny fraction of implantable devices. Where I'm a little bit more concerned is we know that Tommy Thompson, who was the former head of Health and Human Services, probably the most powerful public health official on planet Earth, was in charge of the FDA when they approved the Verichip. Shortly after that, he resigned from his post and took a position on the board of directors for the Verichip Corporation. So you've got a very powerful public health official linking up with this company. And he did a number of television interviews in which he said that he looked forward to the day when all Americans would have a microchip implant to manage their electronic medical records. And the electronic medical records are a core issue here in Australia, as you know, and are certainly a big part of the Obamacare bill. Okay, we have time for one or two more?
I think we've got time. Maybe two more.
Okay.
Go for this one.
Yes, sir.
Most people I don't think are aware of what's going on. I mean, most people don't know what an RFID chip is.
That's right.
So basically, you have a education from how do you make there's politicians won't respond to to this kind of issues unless they feel their constituency, you know, is a large enough, and people are just not aware of.
It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. I'm an unfunded volunteer and have been for 11 years. I mean, they're really, when I go to testify on these issues, when I head up to the state capitals or the Federal Trade Commission or wherever it is that I go, I've testified before the European Commission and elsewhere. When I go there, I'll frequently be in a room where I'm the only citizen and there are 15, 20 lobbyists. And in my own home state of New Hampshire in the United States, where there's only 1.3 million people, we're all apple orchards and little white picket churches. In our little tiny state capital, there are lobbyists, and I actually looked one of them up, the guy who always testifies against me whenever these bills come up, and they always win. He makes $500,000 a month. That's what he's paid to fight me. So it's tough when you're up against that kind of money. Take a look at the companies. Walmart is one of the biggest forces behind this. Walmart, Tesco, the biggest grocery chain in the UK, huge. Procter & Gamble founded the organization that created this technology. Procter & Gamble is the biggest consumer product company on earth. That's who we're up against. These companies are enormous. And they have, you know, when one of our articles came out, they actually sent to the Associated Press, they sent a delegation of lawyers who went in, I kid you not, they went in with flip charts about me. They had huge diagrams, like 4 or 5 lawyers walking in, saying, we don't like this stuff that you're printing about our industry.
They propose that you be shipped.
Well, they did. They actually did get into my bank account, my phone records, and at one point I even got a gun. Spent a number of years. That's when I was researching Spychips. It was a very scary time. So that's another thing you want to hold on to. I can say that as a woman who was living in fear, that I didn't know who was after me or why. And I'll tell you, when I had to get up at night just to go to the refrigerator for a glass of milk, it was nice to know that I was defended. So don't let that one go either. That's a very important freedom. One more. Sorry.
Hi, Catherine Albrecht, which we'll be talking later.
Hello, Emil. Nice to meet you.
I have a lot of respect for what you're doing in the privacy space, and but I do, I have some questions. Maybe we'll talk later. But the one thing that I wanted to discuss openly here is that there's a lot of misinformation about RFID that's out there, particularly.
A lot.
And actually, some of it is concerning. I don't want to diminish what you're doing, but even on the fact page that you have, there's certain terms that you use and bring up information to good intent, but it is factually incorrect.
Was there something in my presentation today that you wanted to correct, Emil?
Presentation, no. But one of the just comes to mind. One of the things, City Watcher, on your fact page, you use the word mandate. Implants.
They did not. That was Sean Darks and one of his voluntary employees. And in fact, his second employee had it in a keychain. Yeah. So no, they didn't mandate it. I never said they did.
But that verbiage is on some of your page.
Point it out to me, I'll correct it, because I would be the first to say that City Watcher did not mandate that anyone receive a microchip. But that is a case in which employees were microchipped for the performance of their job.
Correct.
Yeah. Was there anything else with respect to today's presentation that you wanted to correct? Because I don't want any misinformation to stand. All right.
Actually, as General Chair, I'll just jump in. I think we've got time for one last question, and I'll take it if nobody minds. Some of the language which you perhaps use in your presentation is very provocative, and a lot of those provocative statements are represented as scientific fact. So, for example, are the cancer-causing microchips used in animals the same as those used in people? When in actual fact you have 4 possibilities and entertain the idea that it's not actually the microchip that's causing cancer.
Well, but I'm citing the researchers themselves who actually use the word cause in their research, as I pointed out in one of the earlier slides.
Are the cancer-causing microchips?
Well, based on the research that I've read, I have actually concluded that those microchips have caused cancer. Absolutely, it is.
Okay. Studies that did not show cancer, yes, but they're short studies with a small number of animals.
Correct.
Would imply that there were no longer studies.
There have not been, to my knowledge.
But actually, there's no reported studies.
Okay. If someone knows of a study, I'd be the first to want to read it.
But really, it's just the way that these statements are phrased, sort of implies something that perhaps the science doesn't support.
once again, your particular concern there?
Well, for example, studies that did not show cancer, yes, but these are very short studies with a small number of animals.
Right, you're getting my commentary on that. And you can look at the data, it's provided there. There's a chart where you can see how long those animals were studied and how
I'm
many
just
there
concerned
were.
that presented to a lay audience, not this is a lay audience, but if you did present this to a lay audience, is that perhaps
But it's
slightly
factual.
provocative and-
But it's factual. Draw your own conclusion.
One comment
Emil.
that came to mind was Chris Paget scanning UHF tags. And you said, previously that the guy in Walmart could scan, with his inventory scanner, could scan with the driver, the Gen 2 switch UHF. But then you stated that Chris was driving down the street and scanning these out of people's wallets. But in reality, there's no way to tell if those were actual driver's licenses or inventory tags on.
No, he was getting the unique ID number from their e-pass cards.
But does he know that those IDs were coming from non-inventory items, not in storefronts as he passed them, or does he know for a fact that those were coming from people's wallets?
No, that's a very good question. We could ask Chris.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way to know.
Chris sent me his equipment, and I had an e-pass card, and I was able to read it through 2 walls of my home.
Yeah, and that's
So-
understandable. And I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying there's no way to know that those IDs weren't coming.
Right, but the concern here is that once you've got a national ID card or a driver's license or an enhanced driver's license, your number is your number. And all I have to do is stand next to you with a reader in my purse to know that your number, Emil, is 806327. And now any place on the globe that 806327 appears, I know that's you. So I don't need to have the database, I can create it myself.
Well, creating a database, a global database yourself is right in the prospect.
I'm sorry? My favorite database in response to this, and I wish we had plenty of time in a panel because I'd love to respond to that. My favorite database is the EPC database, the UPC database, where people all over the globe have typed in the UPC numbers, the barcode numbers off of products. I mean, they just do it for fun. And you can go in there, you can type in, I'd probably type this in and it would pop up. Someone would have entered that this is Frantel spring water, 600 milligrams, because people sit around doing that. So the idea that when we have companies like Accenture and IBM who make a living actually off of collecting this kind of data on individuals, the idea that they would not create a database when you have a unique ID number associated with you that goes with you everywhere you go would be ludicrous. They would not be doing a service to their shareholders to not collect that information. It will be collected. It will be linked to you. There's a reason why you don't have your social security number across the front of your t-shirt. It doesn't tell me your name, it doesn't tell me anything else, but it unlocks a database with an extraordinary amount of information about you. And it unlocks many databases with different information about you. But that's why we don't wear them around.
But Catherine, the current example is the Google Wi-Fi collection. By collecting device identifiers and then being able to correlate those device identifiers across multiple locations, multiple weather servers, you build a database, or in this case Google considers building a database, which delivers this kind of connectivity. Now that's not RFID chips, but it's the same principle to build a database by correlation.
Yeah, anyone who works in the data space can tell you that that's where the action is right now.
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt at that stage, but I think we've run rather out of time. I'd like you to join me in thanking Catherine for her